my Lord, show me right from wrong. Give me light, make me strong. I know the road is long, make me strong.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. My brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Hafiz Khan and welcome once again to Different Perspectives. And as usual, I start with my weekly reminder. Verily, Allah will never change the condition of a people until they desire to change it themselves. And secondly, those who deny the truth support one another. And if you, that is us Muslims, fail to do likewise, that is support one another, there will be great disorder and corruption in the world. And we see that is prevailing now. So ISIS is no more from all indications. However, the threat to TNT is about to start. In the near future, we could see the return of some of those who left here to join the fake Caliph Baghdadi and his killers of mainly Muslims. They would be returning to your masjids to try to influence your children, brothers, sisters, to their warped thinking, to perhaps commit a terrorist act in Trinidad and Tobago. God forbid. This is real. Think of the consequences to all Muslims in Trinidad if this would happen. We all have to put aside our minuscule differences that we like to magnify into a reason to divide and work together to counter and prevent violent extremism in our masjids, in our community, and in our beautiful country. We must now increase our vigilance and report to our imams, to our jamaats, and if no action is taken, report it to me and the law enforcement agencies. Do not stay quiet and regret that you could have helped the community and the nation. I can tell you that authorities are putting together a detailed plan to deal with those returning fighters in a humane way. And the Muslim community are involved in the planning process through the Muslim Roundtable group. This is an umbrella group made up of all the major organizations and NGOs in the Muslim community. There are a few minor groups that are not yet part of the organization. However, the intention is to reach out to them and to bring them to the fold. Today, our topic is countering and prevention of violent extremism, which really is about the returning fighters. This is known by the acronym CPVE. I have as my guest to discuss this issue a Muslim brother from the US who have studied throughout the world and have researched this phenomena for a number of years. He is due to submit his PhD thesis, which he will tell us about, in 2 weeks at Harvard University. Howard? He is Mohammed Fraser Rahim, and I welcome him to IBN, to Different Perspectives, and to Trinidad. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you very much. It's an honor and privilege to be able to be in Trinidad and Tobago. It feels like home, and as an African American, some of our roots we've traced back to the Caribbean. And so it's certainly, it feels comfortable, and certainly being accompanied by my Muslim brothers too as well. Thank you.
So, as I said, what are the areas covered in your doctorate thesis?
So my doctorate work, I studied under Dr. Suleiman Yang, a well-known scholar of Islamic thought, of African studies at Howard University, the preeminent university, particularly in Washington, D.C., looking at issues of Islam, Africa, particularly also on the issue of extremism. And at Howard, my dissertation is titled The Making of an American Islam and the Emergence of Islamic Intellectual Thought to Counter Extremism. And it's a case study of an American Muslim revivalist in the United States who talks about the idea of how one can look at the complexities of the historical past of Islam, the challenges that we have run across and run into in light of Muslims being confronted with various world events, and what I call a 42-year counter-radicalization program that this particular imam, the late Worthy Muhammad, implemented. He offers one perspective out of many perspectives. As you know, there's great mujahideen who have come throughout Islamic history, and he offers one particular view, but I think a very compelling one. And as they say, a good dissertation is a done dissertation. And so I had to focus in, and I think it offers some very good gems to borrow from that certainly, and perhaps in Trinidad and Tobago, could be very resourceful, and other Muslim locations throughout the world. I think the main point, particularly in Muslim societies, is, we're confronted with a very difficult issue. And these difficult issues we're confronted with require us to recognize practical solutions, to work across cultural, ideological lines, and find some common ground to push back and to encourage and develop healthy communities.
And we'll get to those in a while, but for the benefit of viewers, just to create that credibility that we need,
Sure.
to give us a brief background on how involved you have been in the whole process of identifying these nuances.
So I'm a product of, I always start out, I'm a product of the community. I am a third generation African-American Muslim. My grandparents converted to Islam back in the 40s. And so I would say that's the starting point where my family members saw the need for proper education, certainly proper Islamic education, to encourage us to understand the classical Islamic tradition, to understand and value this as critical. And so I give credit to those formative years in my birth city of Charleston, South Carolina. My father was the imam of the mosque I grew up to as well. And I studied classical Islamic traditional sciences throughout the Middle East and in Africa, and then certainly in America. So I see that as certainly development years to develop the right understanding, the proper understanding, and take, as we know in the Islamic tradition, uswatun, the middle way, yeah. Right? The path of the way of Muhammad, the Prophet ﷺ. Moderation, right? And so that gave rise to then my journey to working in, I worked in government for 10 years, working on counterterrorism issues, as a Muslim myself, trying to make sense of these issues, because as you know, it's so important for us collectively to be involved with issues, and we can't just, our voice should be heard. So, and our diverse...
Well, in our voice, we should actually be involved.
We should be involved, absolutely.
We should be proactive.
Proactive, and so that's what I did and served, and I worked at these issues across the world. I worked on peace-building efforts as well. Formerly was working at the U.S. Institute of Peace as well, globally. And then I left and now work for a think/do tank where we work on counter-extremism issues. It's the first organization comprised of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and individuals themselves who were formerly involved with extremist organizations. I start off to say that because, as you know, individuals' experiences as formers, myself was not a former, but individuals who were formers, members of Al-Qaeda, individuals of the Hizb ut-Tahrir, members of Al-Muhajirun, another organization, who were certainly involved and indoctrinated in this extremist mindset. And they went down that path to make that exit. And from that experience, working these issues for over a decade, our organization, like many other organizations, have come up with a formula and some good gems, some good practices to make sure that individuals aren't going down that same journey, including those who have joined the Islamic State.
And that has given you an opportunity in your research process to actually meet with guys who were involved.
Absolutely.
Current day.
Absolutely.
Right.
So I've met with individuals who have been indoctrinated into the extremist thinking, and sometime when they're talking, as you can imagine, some of this is mental health issues.
Right.
So we have to look at this in its full
Broad,
spectrum,
yeah.
broad, right? Some of it is not just heavily theological issues; it's mental health challenges compounded with individuals' warped interpretation of
And
this
emotional
beautiful-
issues also.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how would you define violent extremism?
So I would, violent extremism is individuals who've gone down this pathway, believing that their behavior, their mindset, their viewpoints are justified using means to hurt, inflict harm on individuals, and they've developed an extreme behavior outside of mainstream. And so individuals, as you can imagine, violent extremism takes its shape and form in many different countries, in many different localities. And so violent extremism globally speaking, has morphed itself into a local reality as well. And so I highlight to say that, violent extremism is those behaviors that are outside the norm, that's acceptable. In this case, in Trinidadian societies, that promotes pluralism, that promotes tolerance, that promotes and respects the diversity of religious expression. And they seek to break down that peace, just in simple terms, break down that peace that we all need to function in our societies. And so in Trinidad and Tobago, that beautiful unity and diversity is part and parcel, which make you a society that is developing, that's moving forward, that's diversifying, and finding means to develop its nation. And that anyone who seeks to break down that social cohesion is causing harm. And it shouldn't be seen just as a Muslim issue. It shouldn't be seen just as a Hindu issue. It shouldn't be seen as a Christian issue or just a government issue. It's a public health issue, a public safety issue that we all have to be part of and push back against.
So similarly, you would say that those who seek and is creating the crime wave that we have in Trinidad is as a result of that extremism and violent extremism also?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one has to be fair that, crime, violence is also an extremism in another form, right? In my home country, the United States, we have gun violence. That's a form of extremism as well. We have, unfortunately, black-on-black crime. That's a form of extremism as well. So if we want to be honest, which as Muslims, we want to speak to a word of we always want to speak correct. The Quran talks about Salamun qawmin min Rabbi Rahim, peace, a single word from a merciful Lord. Mm-hmm. So if we want to create peace and see peace as essential, we also have to recognize areas that we need to improve upon. And right in Trinidad and Tobago, I think that's important just as much as it is in elsewhere.
So that does not say that one cannot have an objection to an issue. You could have it and be passionate about it.
Absolutely.
But resorting to extreme and violent action is where we draw the line.
Definitely. Within the legal parameters in Trinidadian society, there's much room for free speech. There's a broad room for individuals to have differences of opinion. We know this right in Islamic traditions of ikhtilaf. Differences of opinion have been taking place since the death of Muhammad the Prophet ﷺ and the emerging periods of time where Muslim jurists have debated and had healthy disagreements. So we should still see that as certainly important right in Trinidad and Tobago, that one can have these disagreements, but we need to do it within a way and channel it in a means where we still are respecting one another and we are channeling it in a way where it's in a safe, healthy environment as well.
You have been around the world, and one of the things that I have seen is that as Muslims, we have lost that ability to debate with one another on a comfortable basis. we want to jump to extreme and say and cause names and then say that you are unbeliever. And why why have we developed to that extent? I mean, you're a historian.
Definitely, and so I'm already thinking about historical reference point. You know, in the 15th century in Cairo, there's an interesting Islamic treatise called the Fath al-Bari, Ibn Hajar's, and it talks about this idea of Muslims having the divine, having different viewpoints, and that they were able to read our deeply spiritual, religious, intellectual texts, the Quran, the Hadith.
An educating intellectual.
Yes, in a spiritual, literal, a textual way. And I like to make all these historical reference point practical. When I read that, I think that, you know, one has to think about the same idea in the contemporary context. How are we reading text? How are we reading information? How are we reading historical moments in Islamic history that have a time, place, circumstance? And so I think that one has to not change. We're not seeking to change any of the tradition of Islam, but we're also recognizing that the reality, the contemporary context we live in, require us to think very profoundly, very deeply, what these deeply spiritual verses have in a contemporary meaning, contemporary context. And I think that there are many historical moments. For example, right in West Africa, Al-Hajj Salim Sarari, who led a coexistent movement between Muslims and non-Muslims. So there's a number of examples throughout Muslim history that has demonstrated Muslims engaging with one another. I was visiting an event right before I came here, and the great Ethiopian king who provided refuge for Muslims as well, right? So there's a number of reference points that we have, and I think right in the contemporary context, we need to recognize that we have a deeply reflective past that we can extract good information, but also very much move forward toward the future as well.
And in that particular area, with the cancelling of ijtihad,
yes,
had a profound effect in the whole Muslim psyche. Mm-hmm. And I think as a result of that, the whole intellectual thought process had gone out of Muslims, this civilization generally, from a historical context. And your thesis is done on Islamic thought. Mm-hmm. How do we get that back?
Yeah. You know, I think Muslims have to get back to reading. There's a lot of, if we want to be honest, there's a joke to say there's a lot of Google sheikhs, a lot of Google imams who just, it's easy, right? Modernity has given us a beautiful ability to have access to information. Right. But there's something beautiful about the traditional past where individuals used to take their time and a copy editor used to write down the Mus'haf. And they used to write it down. Individuals used to cherish that. That required time. That required reflection. That required a deep sense of meditation that in some time in the contemporary world, in our busy, fast environment, we've lost. So I think that individuals have to, one, know about their history. I'm on the board of a museum right in Washington, D.C. that traces the history of Muslims, the diverse experiences, various ideological influences, various demographic makeups of Muslims. So one thing I would highlight to say is that within Trinidadian society, knowing about your Trinidadian Muslim history, your larger Caribbean Muslim history, on top of understanding the rise and fall of Islamic civilization and understanding the broader context of just Trinidadian society, and that's important because I think if you know about yourself, if you do that deeply reflective work, then it offers much more context, a deeper sense of who you are and where you're going as well. And I think in the Muslim world, not just in Trinidad, because it's a broader issue throughout the Islamic world, we have missed an opportunity to understand about who we are. Therefore, individuals have shaped perceptions and given you their perception, their geopolitical views, and in many respects, a twisted interpretation of Islam, which, if we want to be honest, and I'm sure we'll get to this as well, the vast majority of those who have been killed by extremist organizations have been fellow Muslims. So they've clearly dominated the conversation away from those of us who just want to have a peaceful life, who want to enjoy the beach, who want to enjoy family, who want to just enjoy living a productive life.
In terms of the Islamic worldview, I think yesterday I had referred to that in terms of lots of time we look at the time of the Prophet in details that are not really relevant to the principles, and we try to go back to 1400 years. And rather than take from the principles and bring it and see how we need to fit into our time, we are looking to go back there to deal with the details. And I was reading a book recently by Abdul Hamid Abu Salam, and from IEEE, and he was looking at the Quranic worldview as a way to reform the Muslims. What are your view in that in terms of how we look at those two particles?
So, I make the statement, it's beautiful to have a sunnah beard. It's beautiful to have sunnah pants. But how about a sunnah heart?
That's right.
Right? The heart.
My sentiments exactly.
Right? The sunnah heart. I mean, there's a wealth of scholars who have talked about this. But the heart is the key, right? The heart, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Quran was revealed on his heart. And so I think there's something deeply important for us to think about. The Prophet was a deeply metaphysical, very deeply spiritual man, but he's also a very simple person who represented a type of person, an example that you can live your life or achieve to be, even if you fall short every single day. So I think that also points to the historical memory of Muslims, in which, historically speaking, I look at our Catholic neighbors throughout the world. And in any Catholic schools, typically, one is taught science, logic, arithmetic, grammar, spirituality. That was very much part of the early Islamic society.
Right. Especially
early
logic,
Islamic education. Logic.
Everyone used to do logic.
So one has to recognize that the Islamic societies of the past, they weren't just religious men. They were also mathematicians,
multi-dimension scholars.
They were diverse. They were musicologists, as we were talking about yesterday. They were scientists. They worked. They were productive citizens. And so I think one has to get back, globally speaking. It's not just a Trinidadian society issue. It's one globally. Muslims have to get back to a broader aspect of understanding their faith and going within and finding and recognizing that one has to be productive member of society to make a contribution. And perhaps I think these individuals in the so-called Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, these organizations are trying to appeal to that imagination, that loss, and trying to create a new image, one that I think is based off a flawed premise. But we have a historical sort of reference point in which we can certainly use, and then create, not to see that those events of the past is the moment to go back to, but recognize these are moments to build upon and to offer even better ways for the future.
All right, so we have reached a donkey here, and I'll take a little break and we'll come back in a sec.
On all grocery items, trust Low Cost Supermarket for the widest variety of quality products at low prices. Freshly picked fruits and vegetables, healthy products for your well-being, high quality meat cuts, and a warm and friendly service. Low Cost Supermarket, Sun and Main Road, Cunupia.
Sheikh Leisure Limited, the leading manufacturers of vermicelli, split peas powder and grease-proof paper. We also manufacture a variety of paper and plastic bags. We have bags for French fries, sandwiches, popcorn, supermarkets, stores, and much more. Whatever your needs, trust Sheikh Leisure Limited for quality products. Sheikh Leisure Limited, Warrenville, Cunupia, telephone 665-3336. Oh.
feel that the sun is hidden by a hazy sky.
A God's gift brought straight from the farm to your plate. Jazza Rice, with its premium range of basmati rice, helping you prepare your perfect, mouth-watering dishes just as you planned. Jazza Rice, blessings in each plate.
Every now and then we need.
This is a Pakistani product, and all over the world, at least try it once. And if it's good, please let us know. We need your encouragement.
Just a little time to breathe.
Welcome back, brothers and sisters, and we are dealing with the return of the foreign terrorist fighters and how we deal with them. We had a preliminary discussion on Islam generally, and our guest, Muhammad. What are the inherent conditions or characteristics that might make a person susceptible to radicalization?
Sure. You know, one thing we say, and based off of, data that's out there globally, academic, government, civil society research by a number of researchers that are out there, the individual pathway, the process to extremism, radicalization, it varies. Individuals have different motivations and reasons, whether it's a sense of loss, wanting to be belonging to a group, individuals maybe having a violent past, individuals who felt alienated, and then, quite frankly, individuals, historically speaking, who've been recruited. So one has to look at that. When we say recruitment, and unfortunately, this has been sort of the pervasive view that someone is coming in and just walking in a very slow way, and he has teeth to just, he's just looking very scary and recruiting someone. That's not necessarily how these things happen. I think it's a slow process. I think there are individuals who go in with an extremist narrative and viewpoints. But also, one has to recognize that the online space, the fact that we're interconnected globally, young people, not just young people, but individuals, adults, women, children, are very susceptible toward extremist recruitment behavior. And, as someone who works with young people, works with individuals who have been radicalized, that process has varied, where individuals have gone online, looked for understanding, and once they went down that pathway, a recruiter was able to get them. And so those families, parents have to put controls on the internet. Those of us who are at the masjid, not just imams or sheikhs or ulamas, etc., they can't just be the only voices. Ordinary citizens, if they see something, they should be aware and they should notify individuals who are able to respond quickly. The goal is to make sure that communities are healthy. At times, individuals will, and they should be prosecuted to the highest extent of the law. But the goal is also to find out what is the root issue of why an individual would even be interested down this twisted interpretation as well.
You use a term there, community should be healthy.
Yeah.
What does that mean in the Muslim context?
So, I'm a big believer of this idea of resilience. This modern day phenomenon issue that we're dealing with, violent extremism, dealing with individuals who seek to have a twisted interpretation of Islam, the approaches would be the same that you're dealing with counter-drug, counter-gang activity. If someone asks you once or 1,000 times, you say no to a gang recruiter. They ask you once or 1,000 times to a drug recruiter, you say no. And the same thing applies to those who are going down this pathway of extremism using the beautiful name of Islam. So communities themselves they're aware of individuals who seek to break down that cohesion that takes place, where communities are able to focus on that spiritual inner path, right? That we all have, right? That I know I need to work on as an individual, that I haven't reached my high perfection, and I'm every day trying to be the better and best Muhammad I can be. The same thing for you and others. So I think what makes communities resilient and healthy is the idea of a couple things, without going too sort of academic. I think it is the idea that resilience is when a shock happens, an event happens. In this case, individuals, family, friends from diverse background have left. And some way there's been an appeal, and they've decided to depart the nation. Or, God forbid, an event happens where there's a terrorist attack. How are communities able to bounce back from those moments? In this case, let's use the first, where individuals have left. How are they able to bounce back and recognize first and foremost that there is an issue? And then after recognizing that there is an issue, what are the next steps? What are the appropriate steps so that that doesn't happen again? That our children, our family members, our brothers, our sisters, our nieces, our nephews, etc., aren't seeing that as an issue, and then recognizing that we need to find measures or structures in place so that doesn't happen again. So resilience is to be able to absorb the shock. In this case, these individuals have left, and then find new means, new mechanisms to make sure that that never happens again. That's within Muslim communities. There's already sort of our deeply spiritual frameworks in place, but we have to recognize that there's an issue in the first place. And that requires a whole of society approach. This issue isn't just a Muslim issue. Let's be very frank here. The Muslim community shouldn't see this as governments trying to cramp down on them. This right here is a responsibility for everyone to make sure that they are living a productive life and to prevent individuals who are trying to impose a version of Islam outside of what we know. And so it's the Muslim community involvement, it's the government, it's the police, it's the Hindu neighbor, it's the Christian neighbor, it's the non-religious neighbor as a whole who see it as important to make sure that if that person's hurting, I want to make sure that I'm doing my part. And if they need steps, individuals, young people need outlets, and they need artistic expressions, or they need music expressions, or whatever outlet that is, that we're working in this in conjunction with one another. And so Muslims, I want to just make that very known, that this issue shouldn't be seen as individuals just dealing with Muslims only. I will say this, is that we have to come to the reality, as a Muslim myself, and all my imperfection, and all that we as individuals have,
right,
we have a problem, and we have to do something about it.
What are some of the strategies that used by ISIS to attract persons to violent extremism?
So I think one of the most, let's use probably one of the most convincing ones in the most recent time, they have a strong advertising campaign. So right now, driving into the studio, you see all the billboards of various advertisers.
Yeah.
Right? You see KFC, you see you see Samsung, you see and Apple, these different brands. And I think what very much the so-called Islamic State has done is been able to appeal using very slick videos. They have been able to use and built and borrowed from advertising campaigns to be able to track individuals. They've been able to exploit on individuals' frustration, the lack of jobs. They've been able to appeal and bring about religious individuals, maybe ability or desire to feel like maybe they are insufficient religiously speaking. So those are just a few that they've been able to tap into, certainly within sort of this, I characterize as an advertising campaign. They're able to recognize that social media is a big way to hook individuals. So Facebook and Twitter, they too have these websites, and they're able to appeal. And I think, quite frankly, they've also been able to use individuals who have talked about the desire and the appeal to join the Islamic State. Now, one of the positive steps is that the fall of Raqqa has taken place, and the geographical location of Syria and Iraq is no longer the hospitable location where they can go to. But there are other geographical locations. What happens when these individuals leave? Do they go to neighboring places in Africa? Do they find another smaller area in the Middle East or in Central Asia? Or do these individuals come back home to Trinidad and Tobago? So these are real concerns. What happens when these individuals are looking for perhaps their own backyard in which they're able to look and know locations, they know the neighborhood, and we must collectively make sure that our communities are resilient, this idea again, and are able to identify early on some of the signs of that. But we also must open our arms up, and we must recognize that individuals will need rehabilitation. And that rehabilitation must be comprehensive, including providing outlets and being able to listen to where they have been, and then also providing them the necessary skills so that they can be productive and integrated members back into society.
In my opening comments, I have invited Muslims to report other Muslims. You know that there are some who would argue that that should not be done. What would you say to those brothers and sisters?
You know, even during the time of Muhammad the Prophet ﷺ, he was vigilant and aware of making sure that the community was protected, right? This is home for many of my Trinidadian and Tobago Muslims. I live in the United States. That's home. The broader Muslim world has its issues, and that's home for individuals who are living there. So I think that we live in these societies. We must protect our nation. Whatever grievance an individual may have, this is no longer perhaps individuals' rationale to say that this is the colonial era nation state that is occupying the parliament. This is a Trinidadian society that has come out and is thriving, and even with all its limitations, it is trying to do its best that it can do. So, you know, one of the beautiful hadith, beautiful gems of the Prophet ﷺ, who said, you know, love of country is part of faith. This isn't some obscure hadith. The love of country is part of faith itself. And so where we are spread throughout the world, will we not think that the early Muslims, Allah and the Quran itself and Muhammad the Prophet would not recognize that one day we would all be dispersed throughout the world? At least my humble interpretation, I would think that one day Muslims, or early Muslim society would know that we would all be spread out. So what I say is that if we're in these locations of where we serve and we live, and this is our home, then we have a responsibility to make sure that we protect those societies we live in. And an individual that wants to challenge that, the earth is spacious. One can travel and go somewhere else. This is the beauty of what any seeker, any Muslim, anyone who's on this path.
As the example by the Prophet himself when he left Mecca and come to Medina.
Absolutely.
When they were trying to kill him there. So rather than destroy here.
Exactly. They can go somewhere else and make hijrah to that other destination. They will learn rather quickly that they will also have to abide by the rules and regulations of these locations. And that in many places that individuals assume is an Islamic country, there are differing views of opinion, different interpretations, and different expressions as well. And so I just bring that point up to recognize, to say that, you know, that hijrah can take place if someone wants to make that journey. But this is home, and individuals have a responsibility to make it the best they can and follow that great prophetic motto of loving your country, which is also part of faith. Still being firm and using all your legal rights to challenge and push back on matters, that's part of this society, this democratic society that you live into as well.
But those who are trying to destroy the society, we need to deal with them.
Absolutely.
Accordingly.
Yeah, I think that, and
even if they call themselves Muslims.
Absolutely. I mean, there are Muslims who, as we started off with, who would be willing to kill you or me. I want to give just a description too as well, just to bring this even more home. The individuals who were killed who, the so-called Islamic State, by their brutality, they killed Muslims who were protecting their own homeland. Or Jordanian pilot, who was burned alive. Individuals drowned to death who were Muslims. They had never met them. They didn't know their ideological viewpoint of Islam. Let's just give that right there. They had no understanding who these individuals were, but they sought to impose their particular version, right? Even if you have one life, you protect it. The Prophet talked about there was rules and regulations and engagement in warfare.
That's right.
How do you treat the tree? How do you treat the plant in warfare? And the beautiful example when the Prophet, ﷺ, who could have easily decided to make sure people were recognizing him being the Prophet of Islam, the Khatam Nabi, the seal of the Prophet, he signed his name as Muhammad ibn Abdullah, seeking to take the middle path.
How critical do you see the current situation of returning fighters to Trinidad?
I think that one has to take the posture with individuals who are returning home, some who are women and children, as an important public safety issue. This isn't just a Trinidadian issue. I'm speaking from someone who travels the world and works on these issues. This is one that we want to understand individuals' motivations and reasons of why they have gone that path. So there's real steps for rehabilitation that has to take place that are tangible steps. So one, they need to come, if they are coming back home, recognize and identify who these individuals are. So one thing that certainly the government itself has to be part of this. And I wanted to be very candid that this issue right here should be seen as it should be a bipartisan issue. This issue itself is one that transcends politics. This transcends socioeconomic issues. This transcends ethnicity. This is about encouraging and making sure that Trinidad and Tobago society is thriving. And so I would imagine that Muslims are directly involved with their rehabilitation. There's excellent tools, but there's also psychosocial efforts that need to take place. There are also mental health issues that need to take place. And then also there's perhaps a law enforcement judicial element of this as well, because individuals have to understand that choices do have consequences. And it needs to be taken very seriously, that this cannot be tolerated in society, and that this is one in which the Muslim community has to be just as involved with and see this as a top priority as law enforcement, as the government at large as well.
And to the credit of the government, they have invited all the stakeholders, as you outlined there, including the Muslim community. So we have been involved in that process and the development of the plan. So I know they're looking to do the right thing. If that works out fine.
Definitely.
But you spoke with the roundtable yesterday, so the leaders of the organizations have an idea of their responsibilities. I would like to give you some advice, give some advice to the imams, executives of Jamaats across the country as to strategies to be employed to deal with these situations.
So I think we've finally come to the point where Muslims, and particularly those with the roundtable, have to recognize that, reaching out to susceptible audiences require creativity. We must finally recognize that not every youth or not every individual will want to always come to the masjid. The various messages that are throughout this island will not always want to go to that location because they may not necessarily feel comfortable. That happens. So what other mechanisms can be taking place that uses art, music, and critical thinking? One of the programs we've been really involved with, and I highlighted with you all yesterday, is that, this idea of critical thinking of our, not just our texts, but also allowing a safe space where individuals are able to engage and talk about maybe sensitive issues that they may not always want to do in an open environment. And so we have to create an environment where individuals are able to come as they are, without judgment. And that also opens up new windows, new opportunities where we can find out some of the issues that may even make communities, individuals susceptible in the first place. So I think one has to get outside the box. But I use that critical thinking, as I mentioned to you earlier, that was certainly part of the deep tradition of Islam in the past. That's synonymous with the halakha circles of learning and studying, and that we certainly know the benefits and virtues of studying Islamic texts, but we also must make this very practical. And we have people in a very busy time who are needing practical efforts that will allow them to function in a very complicated world. So those are just a few that I offer as incentive, that, artistic expressions, individuals maybe doing calligraphy, right? Maybe giving them a responsibility of learning different styles. And yes, everyone won't agree on every matter, but those are just a few that I think can be helpful, that we've seen as successful. We also done something I think rather interesting. We had a play, our organization, that talked about, it was called The Deadly Dialogues, where individuals were talking about what life was like when they joined these movements, and it wasn't always pretty and rosy. And so I think as much as one can provide some theological response, which there is, and it's important, we also have to be just as adaptive to recognize that there are different ways to reach audiences as well.
Do you think that issues like parenting is a key aspect in terms of having a developmental project within the Jamaats as relates to parenting? Because we see that young people who have reached adolescence, they have become the ones who are more susceptible. And this gives evidence that parenting might not have been ideal in the development process.
Just because individuals are Muslim doesn't mean that they have things perfect. Everyone could use a refresher course on parenting and how to reach the children. And so I think that also is a good opportunity to work across civil society. There are good steps and tools that are out there that isn't just a Muslim issue. There's young people, parents of all religion and races, who are struggling with how to provide for their family. You have single mothers who, quite frankly, we have issues of divorce in the Muslim community steadily on the rise. And so one may need to recognize that one has to be flexible and find some good practices to recognize that we are having some young people who are falling by the wayside, and cracks are being, or there's vulnerability. I bring this example too as well, is that, and it's interesting, I think worthy to highlight, in Iceland, there was a recent report that talked about back in the 80s and 90s, they were having difficulty with the young people who were using drugs and alcohol abuse. And then basically in the early 2000s, the Iceland society saw it as a responsibility to make some reform efforts, where parents had to sign a pledge and talk about they would check on their children and be more responsible, that they would have dinners at home, right? That they would also go out, parents, and police the neighborhood. I only give you that example to say that there are good efforts that are already in place throughout the world that one can potentially borrow, and also already happening in Trinidad. So I think the Muslim community is no example. We have the same issues, though we may not talk about it, as other communities as well. We have children out of wedlock. We have domestic abuse, etc. That we must be
marital problems,
and those issues can't always be solved by an imam. Sometimes you have to bring an individual in who has the specialty and expertise to solve this as well. I just offer this as an example. I don't live in Trinidad and Tobago, but I know that these are concerns that globally we are all affected with. And if we want to be honest, then these are just some elements to consider as well.
Well, the organization I lead focuses on counseling and parenting and marriage.
Absolutely.
So even with the parenting programs we use, we have worked with the family life department of the Archdiocese using their program sometimes. So we have worked with interfaith organizations to get the benefit of what they have developed already.
Absolutely.
So that is happening.
Definitely.
But not on the scale that it ought to happen. And there are a lot who are falling through the cracks, as you said. And we hope that with the advent of the roundtable, we'll be able to deal with those issues more comprehensively.
Definitely.
So that would put the community and also spread to other communities what we would have developed in that scenario. What advice would you give to the youth population in this regard, being a youth yourself?
Yeah.
At least looking so.
I'm getting older myself. No, I think that, with the youth, it's important to engage with your population. I mean, talk and be self-expressive. I think, the world is changing. And I think young people aren't even the same in how I was raised, right? There's a lot of factors, a lot of issues being pulled at young people. We have young Muslim children now who are being bullied, right, in school, whether they go to, they're in various school settings. So one has to recognize that, in the public conversation, despite the historical past of Muslims being known for their contribution, the public image is this unfortunate perception of extremism. So I would encourage young people to find a balance, right? To be yourself. And that being yourself will also require, I think, a negotiation oftentimes between the older and younger generation too as well. It's not an easy thing. I remember when I was younger and I was at school and my father wanted me to he wanted me to go to the masjid with him on Friday, and I wanted to go to the basketball game instead, and we used to fight over that, and we eventually reached a compromise, and my sisters and they were playing soccer, and my father wanted my sisters to wear some looser clothes, right? So they compromised. She ended up wearing some shorts, or some pants underneath. And that worked out. That was a negotiation. Yeah. He was struggling, and it was a debate and a compromise and some crying. That was a real dialogue. And so I think same thing with young people is, be able to have that conversation. And I think that intergenerational exchange, one has to give and take. It can't just be it's one way or another, it's black and white. It should be an open dialogue between the two. I think the Prophet ﷺ would have been, in his, how he delivered the message, was always trying to find that middle path as well, as I mentioned to you before. So I think with young people finding other alternative outlets. As I said, music, I think that's an interesting approach. I think that art is another one. I think finding that voice and being proud of who you are, and not in any way, in speaking up and championing and not feeling like the other as well.
And how important is it for Muslims to close ranks and put aside minuscule differences?
I mean,
all over.
Yeah, all over, yeah. I think that, this is the big issue. I mean, listen, Muslims have differing view on doctrinal matters, right? Should I pray a certain way? Is my hands too low? Is my tajweed the proper way it should be? I mean, this is all throughout the world, and we've seen, honestly and unfortunately, individuals who've died because of small minutia of details. And at the end of the day, Allahu Alam, He knows best, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the Muslim community has to recognize, at least on this particular issue, we must come together. There are a number of masajids that you can go visit, and you can go pray there. And areas that we don't always agree in, that's fine. When we can come together, we should be united on those fronts too as well. So I think that, some of these small religious matters that I think really aren't helping, we have to put these matters aside because they don't promote the unity that we need to have. Individuals can, again, they can focus on other matters and spend the rest of their week, those 6 days of the week, doing something else. But in this particular time that we live in, on this issue, we should be united on.
Unfortunately, we're out of time now, and our past very quickly.
Definitely.
So I want to say thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And all the advice you had to give and the knowledge that you shared with us. My brothers and sisters, we have come to another at the end of an interesting, different perspectives, and we ask you to join us again next week for another one. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.